Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening to everyone. This is Joseph Trevisani from FX Solutions uh, for our monthly webinar. The topic today is, we'll start out as the currency. Currency, shall we say, inquiry, but very quickly will become a historical and a political inquiry. There's really no other way around that. I'm taking this from a column I wrote 2 weeks ago called The German Reformation. To put in some history in this, and the reason I'm doing this is because although what's happening with Euro, the Europeans, the EU, the EMU, Greek debt, Portuguese debt, Spanish debt, Italian debt, appears to be, on the surface, strictly a currency, financial market, banking system, if you will, matter. But of course, that is not the case. It is the continued playing out of a very, very long and old theme in European history, which the Europeans, post-World War II, have tried very forcefully and largely successfully to put in their path. It seems, perhaps, that, as with Freud, things denied surface in another area. So let's just look at it from a historical point of view first. Since, for 150 years, really, but a little less, the history of Europe has been the history of the contention between Europeans, and forgive me if anyone else does not have this view. These are my views of history, of course. They're reflected in many other places, but they are my views. Has been the conflict about Germany. Germany is by far the largest, well, not so much population, but it's by far the largest bloc population country in Europe. It has had the largest economy for many, many years. And in many ways, it has the most productive economy, in the sense that its goods are more in demand around the world than any other country. And that really is including the United States, except for Europe. Some of the symbols of modern life, especially modern middle-class life, the car, is almost a German. The German preeminence there is astonishing. Until I believe last month, Germany exported more goods by value than any other country in the world. They were just taken over, again, I believe it's last month, by China. Germany's population is 82 million. China's population is 1.3 billion. That is 16 times different. So the German ability, and this must be recognized because it's a fact, to create products that the rest of the world wants is unsurpassed in the modern era. So Germany's dominance in this sense, in the economic sense of the continent, has not changed. So let's look at history. The history of the last century is a history of world wars based in Europe and largely either fomented or begun, in fact, by Germany. Germany's position in Europe, strategic position militarily on the north plain of Europe between two major powers, Russia and France, is strategically dangerous. It is something that German governments, regardless of what you think about their policies, have attempted to deal with two world wars within 25 years of each other. Those wars were not successful, but they clearly outline the strategic problem of Germany's location. After the Second World War and its horrors, the European politicians, and I'm sure representing very well the European population, wanted to avoid that occurrence again. So, beginning in 1950, with the European Steel and Coal Pact, which was actually signed, I think, in 1961, which was proposed by a French foreign minister at the time, Robert Schuman, in a speech in 1950. The purpose, the very explicit purpose of Mr. Schuman and all of the European politicians who followed was to bring Germany into a economic and political union that would prevent, make inconceivable another occurrence of the tragedies of the First and the Second World War. As a matter of fact, his quote in that speech is that, in which he proposed the Union project, was that any war between France and Germany, and that was the core of it, of course, would not be merely unthinkable, but materially impossible. The goal and the process of the European Union was to bind Germany within strong European institutions that treated all members the same, that would minimize Germany's historical grievances in the eyes of the rest of Europe, perhaps, and make it almost impossible for Germany to exercise its strength over its neighbors. These policies have been completely successful. The idea, and long before the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, Germany was no longer responsible, really, for its own defense. Germany, the divided country and the divided capital, although it wasn't the capital at the time, Berlin, was the front line between the Warsaw Pact and NATO. Germany was a part of NATO. But the troops, German troops as well, and everyone else who was in Germany on the North German plain, were under NATO command. This is certainly a huge change from the independent German military from the earlier part of the century. So this part of the binding of Germany into the European community was extremely successful and not objected to at all by the Germans, and I don't believe it was now either. The economic part of that was the European Union, what ended up to be the European Union. In the beginning, it was just the Coal and Steel Pact between Germany and France. But as I said earlier, it was a very deliberate, integrated plan. It was not meant to be just a Coal and Steel Pact that suddenly a few years later somebody had the bright idea that, oh, let's make the integration a little stronger, let's make the connections a little tighter. No, that was most assuredly the plan of the politicians who started this, Schuman and others, from the very beginning. So you ended up with the EEC at the Treaty of Rome, and you ended up eventually with the Maastricht Pact, which created the Euro and the ECB, which is now being tested, shall we say. So that side of the economic union has also worked very well, although now it is coming under strain, which I'll deal with in a few minutes. The last part of this type of integration, military, economic, would be political. That has, in some fashion, although one seems to know how, seems that the Americans are not the only ones who are capable of endless and impenetrable legislation. We have ours, and you guys have and the Europeans have the Lisbon Treaty. Its goal, although that was rejected by many people and is actually rejected by much of the population, well, I'm not sure what the recent polls are, for political integration based on a bureaucracy in Brussels, is the goal of the Lisbon Treaty. So the ultimate goal of the European Union has always been a unified, if you will, military, economic, and political entity. The most striking success of that unity so far, until quite recently, has been the euro. The speed with which the euro became a world currency and was accepted, not only by retail, which is obvious, the ease of traveling across Europe with one currency speaks for itself, And the business applications of that also speak for themselves. Of course, it's going to be accepted as long as it's not a farce, and it was not, most assuredly. But the international financial markets, which have, if you might say, higher standards of long-term value and on store of value considerations, has also been accepted. The euro very quickly became a secondary reserve currency, if you will. I know that might be a bit unpopular, and there are drawbacks with this, but there is no doubt that many banks and many central banks keep a portion of their reserves in euro. So we have a very powerful symbol of European integration which touches everyone's life. If you live in France or in Germany or Belgium, until the euro, you could make a real question. You could give a real question about what benefits do I have from the union? How does it touch my life? After the euro and the success of the euro, that question is very easy to answer in a very positive fashion. So the euro has been extremely popular, I think, certainly economically, certainly on the retail side for everyone there, and internationally as I say. However, let's just take a look at one thing before I continue. This chart right here that you should all see, this is a Bloomberg chart. Given the rate where we are now, you might think this is, I don't know, a 10-year bond perhaps, 30-year bond. Obviously not a United States bond. It is in fact the current chart for the Greek 2-year. I know. I was very surprised myself when I took a look at it. The Greek 2-year bond is paying the same as the Greek 10-year bond. In fact, it's paying a little bit more. What does that tell you about the market's assessment of Greek default risk? It is extremely high, at least in what a bond investor would want to be compensated to take on that risk. And before we listened to Walter Wriston, long ago when I was in college, chairman of Citigroup, who built it into its worldwide franchise at the time, that countries don't default, he of course is incorrect. Countries most assuredly do default. We've seen two in the past 10, 12 years, Argentina and Russia. And Greece certainly is a possibility, at least as being judged by the market. But back to the history. What the euro enabled the weaker economies, the economies that are not as efficient, the economies whose products are not in demand around the world because they are high value added products. A Mercedes is a high value added product. Nobody makes them except the Germans. I own 2 Jettas myself, and they are and were, this is not a product endorsement, it's not a product placement, we don't do that here. They were very good cars, and there's no question about this. Their products are extremely high value added. And this goes not just for consumer products, but especially across the range of industrial, machine tool, chemicals, the entire range of industrial products, engineering products. For countries such as Spain and Greece, the products of their countries, while maybe desirable, do not have that same type of, shall we say, inflexible demand structure. So for countries such as that, there has always been, up until now, and don't forget, we have been running on sort of a 10-year boom here, certainly for the last 4 or 5 years until the great crash, which supported all economies. And the euro has only existed in this type of environment. Yes, there was the dot-com crash in the United States in the early part of the last decade, and there was a recession that followed that, a short one. But these were not serious, they were not deep, and they did not really test the euro's idea of unity and how it was formulated and what was playing out in the country. But we have seen now what has happened. the countries whose economies were not as efficient as Germany's, and there are probably a number of other countries that are in this category, not just Germany, were enabled by the euro to borrow at much lower rates than they would have normally. The implicit idea, much like the Americans with Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, having an implicit guarantee from the government, which did in fact turn out to be an explicit guarantee once the pressure came down. The assumptions have been for the countries of the EMU that this is true as also. And so until this crisis blew up really late last year, the assumption has been, even though it's specifically not allowed in the Lisbon Treaty that members cannot lend money to each other to take care of problems like this, the market assumption was always that Greece's credit was dependent on German credit worthiness. We are now seeing a divergence in that. So, if we look back at the historical application of this, the incorporation and the successful incorporation and the successful strategic answer to the problem which had been the primary world foreign affairs problem for the first 50 years of the last century was settled. Germany became, it was perhaps a very difficult solution since it involved 2 world wars. Nevertheless, the solution, the international, if you will, solution, the supranational solution, perhaps is a better way to put it, that the Europeans engineered was successful without question. You know, if anyone has any questions, just type them in. I'll do my best to answer them. I realize this is not a specific currency, technical analysis, where to trade, when to trade presentation, but if you have any questions or any comments, please type them in, and I'll be glad to answer them as we go. I think that's probably more involving than simply listening to me lecture, as if I had a podium. In fact, I'm in my office in New Jersey for 45 minutes. And we have a question. Should higher Greek yields stabilize the euro? No. I don't know if any of you have seen the American movie Jerry Maguire. It's a Tom Cruise movie. At some point in the movie, when he's trying to get a contract, I think, I've actually not seen the movie, he's a sports agent. He screams over the phone, famous line now, which you've heard in relation to the Greek problem a number of times now. I used it myself about 2 weeks ago. Show me the money. The problem with Greece is no longer yields. Yes, if the Greeks were paying 10%, they would probably be able to sell their bonds. I mean, they sold them 2 weeks ago at about 6 something, I think. But it won't take away the problem, because the problem is fast becoming and focusing on default risk. Will the Greeks want to contract for billions of dollars of debt at 7, 8, 9%? A huge premium over what they have been paying and what their budget, what they have budgeted for. So I don't think that higher Greek yields will stabilize the euro. The only thing that will stabilize the euro is a solution when somebody steps up and guarantees Greek debt or lends Greece the money at different rates, not private market rates, to permit the Greeks to continue to refinance their budget deficit and their bonds, which are coming due this year. I think there's about 30 billion which are coming due this year. Now, this doesn't seem like a large amount when you're dealing with the United States economy and other large industrial countries. Nevertheless, it is a very large amount for the Greek economy and for the productivity of the Greeks. That is definitely the case. So normally, back to the unity. So the German integration into Europe has been extremely successful. The problem is that it has enabled other countries in the EU to piggyback on the strengths of the German economy without having similar strengths in their own economy or going any route to get to that efficiency. Greek wine, as good as it is not a product that is going to compete with Mercedes and Volkswagen. It will never be the high value added product that the German economy specializes in. Now, this was not a situation or a development which was not thought of by the people who designed and set up Wim Duesenberg, the first head of the ECB, was one of them. He was not very old. He died maybe in his late 60s of cancer a few years ago. He was a heavy smoker. Not that I know the man, I've just seen pictures. This was certainly thought of, and it was one of the reasons that the Germans insisted on the 3% and 60% deficit and debt limits being incorporated in the Growth and Stability Pact, which was added onto the Maastricht Treaty. Because it is very basic economics, this situation which has developed. The Germans are trying to prevent that. Also, the prohibition against lending within the EU to member nations. Same idea, same reason. It was hoped and thought that the economic and currency convergences fostered by the euro would force economies to compete, meaning improve their competitive stance within the European Union and primarily against the North European countries. That actually has not proven to be the case. What happened, as we all know, that the Greeks and the Germans, and that the Greeks and the Spanish and the Portuguese went out and borrowed and used that money to support their budget deficits, to pay for all sorts of great retirement benefits. I have read that there are certain Greek jobs that they can retire in their early 50s, maybe 55, and they get these wonderful pensions. And in Germany, the retirement age is much higher. And you, in effect, from a political point of view, have something that's extremely unpalatable for the German voting population. And that is, you have Germans who can retire, for instance, at 65, supporting Greeks while they're retired who can retire at 55. This is not something which flies politically. It gives, and Angela Merkel is extremely cognizant of this, and she knows that it's popular, but there is also this view, and why she's supporting it. I'll answer that question in 1 second. But there is also a very realistic problem here. One which, if it is not prevented, will end up diminishing both the value of the euro and the value of the euro to its participating economy. The Germans cannot, and up until now, and I will not get into the mass psychology of it, if you will, but the Germans up until now have probably been the foremost Europeans. They did grumble sometimes, but they very often paid when they were asked to pay by the rest of the Union. This time, they do not appear to be doing so. Let me answer a question here, and then I'll continue with the discussion. Yes, if you look at the chart in the euro, let me bring up the euro chart here. I mean, this is the euro chart from late last year. This is a daily euro chart, and this is what date is it? It's around mid-December. This might as well be a chart of the Greek problem, because that is what has been the force driving the euro down this entire time. Yes, I mean, there's some added pressure from the United States economy or the comparison between the United States economy and the European economy, because certainly growth figures in others are doing better, although our unemployment is worse. Historically, the U.S. has always had a stronger recovery because its economy up until now has been less regulated. So you get stronger return after a deep deep recession. But this chart primarily is a chart of the Greek problem. So its ability to drag down the euro is very strong. If we want to look at, let's say, a longer run here, let's take this out. This goes back to '09. I should make this chart a little longer. But certainly from a trading point of view, there isn't any reason that the euro should not go back to 124, 125 if this European problem is not solved. And certainly if Greece defaulted on its debt, then the euro would. Is there anyone who would not speculate short euro who's in any way connected with the currency markets? I think the answer is probably pretty obvious to that. The euro yen as well, and the euro crosses as well. So you have a real sense that this is something which could drive the euro much further. Don't forget, the operating assumption right now remains, and it remains for myself as well, that Greece will not be allowed to default. Now, does that mean that Greece won't have to pay 8% or 9% on a 10-year? No. But I think before that, Greece will go, if necessary, unilaterally to the IMF. Now, are the IMF terms going to be better? That's a good question. I don't really know. I don't think the Greeks do either, but they're also sort of out of options. Nevertheless, I do not think that the Europeans will let this go down. On the other hand, it is quite possible, and this is the other thought on the title of my piece 2 weeks ago, The German Reformation. Two things are possibly happening here. The first one's easy. Germany is an export-driven economy. Okay? It's not necessarily a bad thing for that export economy. I know you'll get other arguments about this. Certainly with Mr. Geithner in Beijing right now. That was kind of interesting. He was in India, which is a Asian competitor for China, and a very different political system there, since they have a very functioning democracy as opposed to the Chinese system. And he is visiting there, and as soon as the Chinese mention a desire for a meeting, he flies off, and the Indian trip is completely buried in the news and in international consideration by the fact that Mr. Geithner is flying up to Beijing. Whatever else is involved here, it was certainly one way for the Chinese to give the Indians a bit of put them into place, I suppose. And there's no doubt that that's part of it. The Chinese and Indians have fought several wars, although not recently, in the Himalaya over various border disputes. So they are certainly competitors for influence and power in that part of the world. So back to the German problem. So the Germans are the most dominant. I see there's someone listed as looking as Paul Volcker. It must be spelled differently, but I'm not really sure. Let me answer these questions. I would agree with you that the U.S. economy is not emphatically better, in better shape than the European. I would agree with that. And that's why when we looked at that chart, I agree, and I think that the major reason the euro has such a strong move down is the Greek problem, not the dominance of the U.S. economy in this recovery. Although we had 5.6 last quarter, this quarter is probably around 2.5 to 3. Nobody's really sure. A lot of variety on that. Initial jobless claims were up again, even very much as unexpected. So there are a lot of questions. So I would agree that it's not really the U.S. economy that's driving the improvement of the dollar. It certainly doesn't look like the Fed is going to be raising rates anytime soon. So there really isn't any benefit to the U.S. from that particular analysis. A small amount perhaps, but not a large. So we have, back to our topic, we have now two things going on in the euro. This is a very deliberate and not only politically palatable move for Angela Merkel and the Germans in the EMU and in the euro, in that the German economy will benefit from a cheaper euro for their exports. There is also a sense, although it is not much discussed, that in order for the euro to continue as a viable, sustainable, strong currency, something has to give. And what has to give is being dictated by the people who have the money. And I know this sounds a bit like a lesson in family economics or trying it for a mortgage, but in fact it's true. If anyone is going to be able to support or bail out the Greeks, who don't want to have to pay 7.53% for 2-year money, an unheard of rate. It's basically a default rate. The U.S. 2-year, I think, is around 1%. If you look at the Greek chart, up until this crisis blew up, in November and December, it was about 1.5%. Not that much more than what you're paying than what the U.S. Treasury had to pay for the same kind of money. I've never seen a chart like this. It's in currency crises and default crises, the ruble crisis, the ERM crisis in the mid-90s in Europe when they tried to keep European currencies within trading bands, much as the Chinese and now want. This is essentially a default indication. Interesting, astonishing, great for trading. Anyway, there aren't any methods for the Europeans to take care of this problem without the Germans, which gives the Germans the overriding hand, the overriding control, the overriding decision in this crisis. You know, when the Germans gave up the Deutschmark, and much is made of the inflation in Germany in the early 20s. There's that famous picture, which I'm sure everyone has seen, of wheelbarrows going to buy bread, a wheelbarrow full of money going to buy bread. Not being German, not having lived in Germany, not speaking German, I cannot talk, intelligently about how strong an effect this has and has had in the German view of finance, the German view of saving, and the other things, cultural values that go into making up a people and a population's view. After all, the Americans don't save very much. Other cultures do save a great deal. The difference has its origin in history and in culture. So I can't really speak to that. But certainly it was true in polls at the time when Germans adopted the euro and gave up the Deutschmark, that it was unpopular in Germany, that they would have preferred, and perhaps they realized it was unrealistic at the time, someone is telling me my parents still calculate prices in Deutschmark. I was in Ireland about 5 or 6 years ago, and I went into this map store looking to buy some old maps, and all of the prices were still in Irish punts. And the man who ran the store was the grandson of Andrew Bonar Law, who was a British prime minister in, if I remember, the 1920s. And he didn't feel like changing the prices, so everything was still in Irish punts rather than in euro. I thought that was pretty interesting. And he had a lot of good maps. Anyway, so the Germans were very reluctant to give up on a retail level. They were very reluctant to give up the euro. So there is strong sentiment, not only in the population, amongst people and the voters, but also in German government and German academic and finance circles, that if the Deutschmark, now euro, is to be protected, is to maintain a strong currency, in a high-value export economy, a strong currency is a benefit. It permits you to, the products that you produce have such high value that their price is relatively inflexible, meaning that the demand is not nearly as variable dependent on price. If you want a Mercedes, then you are going to buy a Mercedes unless you honestly can't afford it, because your view of the product is such that it's worth the money. Therefore, a strong currency, of course, keeps inputs low, the input costs relatively low, and permits a relatively high profit margin on various products. So for the German economy, which does not really compete on price. Yes, of course it does to a certain degree, but to a much lesser degree than any other economy. I mean, if you are looking at, say, when I buy toys for my kids, my girls, of course everything is made in China. I mean, well, I think I mentioned the last webinar. I went into a big department store in Beijing looking to buy toys, which I realized after about 45 minutes looking around that I was extremely foolish, since all the toys I could already buy in the United States and Toys R Us are made in China, so I'm looking at the same toys. But those products are not necessarily high-value products. It has to do with efficiency. It has to do with the health of the Chinese government, many other factors. But in fact, if those prices rise, and this is one of the concerns of the Chinese government right now, if those prices rise dramatically because their currency appreciates, then it is, if that is expected to maintain itself over a number of years, over a production cycle for a factory that would be built, then that production will move to a lower cost country. There isn't a lot of value added to the toys. They're relatively simple products. So for a country like that, the currency route for productivity is much more open. So for a number of reasons, and those are two of them, the German view of the EMU is one of a strong currency, and that it is a real value to the German economy, to the German, I might say, psyche, to the German system, the German banking system, to maintain that strong currency. It was certainly true of the Deutschmark. Although the Deutschmark had much variation in trading. I spent most of my career as a trader, trading the Deutschmark and trading the European crosses. There was a great deal of variation. But from an export point of view, the Deutschmark was a valuable currency. The view of the EU now, and the view of the Germans now, is that if the EMU's methods, if you will, their concept, in fact, is not reformed, and that's why I called my column the German Reformation, not hearkening back, of course, to the 16th and 17th century and religious wars in Europe, but to, I think, the idea that the EMU, in the view, I think, of the Germans, must be reformed into a body of members who will maintain the same type of strong currency outlook, strong currency economies that Germany itself has benefited from for so many years. The question, of course, is how will that take place? I don't think, and this is not meant to be either a criticism or praise of any of these countries, but I do not think you will turn the Greek economy into the German economy. I don't think you'll turn the Spanish into the Greek or any of these other things. The Italians are a bit odd case, a separate case, because there are, perhaps for different reasons, but there are many products, and this may be true. I'm not that familiar with the industrial products of Portugal and Spain and Greece, but the Italians have a slightly different case because their economy does produce a number of very high value product sectors. Fashion is one, of course. Cars are probably another. I believe chemicals as well. So there are high value products, and I'm sure there are high value products coming out of Spain and Portugal and Greece as well. It's just that as a dominant force in the economy, I don't think that's really true. So I don't think you're going to turn those countries, certainly Portugal, Spain, and Greece, into the German type of export model. So the question is then, how do you maintain a strong euro when these types of debt have, and don't forget that the Greek debt is the highest deficit, but it's not out of order. Spanish deficit is up there. Portuguese deficit is up there. The Italian, I think, is a bit lower. The Irish, I believe they have been quite successful in putting through an austerity budget, but Ireland is like Greece, it's a very small country. And the English deficit, the British, is about 11.4%. So the question is, how do you get a strong currency without the ability of these countries to reform their economy to an enormous degree in a very short amount of time? People become used to the benefits that they get from the government. It is not a bad thing from a personal point of view if one wants to retire at 52 to be able to retire at 52. I'm not sure I would want to, but that is not the right question. So if the Germans do, and the other Europeans do permit the Greeks to be bailed out in some fashion, as I still think they will, the goal seems to be, because of what, and the Greeks are unfortunately a poster boy for this, the Greek government, in that they did not quite tell the truth when they joined, as far as some of their budget criteria necessary to join the euro. I think it was 2001. And certainly the last Greek government, which is in fact a conservative government, was extremely, let's put this judiciously, was extremely creative in describing their budget deficit and the information they gave to the rest of the EU. So given these things, the other countries in the EMU are not at all disposed to believe what the Greeks are saying. But there is another issue here. Greece, as in all of the other countries in the EMU, I'll answer these questions in a second. Greece, as in all other countries in the EMU, is a democracy. Democratic governments change. Why should, and I think this is what I think is the main doubt, that even if the current Greek government not only says they will do this, but gets it through the legislature, the budget to reduce 4% over a year, it's astonishing. What is to say that in 2 years or in 3 years, this government does not fall, that another government comes in, that due to the potential unrest, the disagreement, loses the election, a different government comes in and says, we are not going to do this. What are you going to do? So that is a genuine and real concern that I don't really see any answer to, as far as how the rest of the Europeans view the current Greek promises and current Greek political establishment and democracy. Let me just look at these questions. The reason the Greeks they're hesitating, I think, to take money from the EMU, from the IMF. Even though, remember, one of the things going on here 2 weeks ago, or 2.5 weeks ago, the Greek Prime Minister said, look, if you guys, meaning the rest of the EMU, does not come up with a loan, or some sort of plan by the end of the EU summit, which was Thursday and Friday, 2 weeks ago, this Friday, then we are going to go to the IMF. Now, it was interesting that a country, a political system in the situation Greece is in, is uttering threats to its potential rescuers. Nevertheless, that's what happened. Now you get the MNI story from 2 days ago that they don't really like the idea so much of going to the IMF. So this kind of confusion is very much driving the markets and the euro down and Greek debt really down. The problem is that the IMF is not a warm and fuzzy organization. And on top of that, they're based in Washington and get the bulk of their money, or at least the largest part of their money, from the United States. The terms and the history of the IMF have been from a international finance point of view, not from a domestic political point of view. The terms are not going to be fun. Now, are the Greeks going to get better terms from the EU? No, I doubt it. On the other hand, I think they feel that the EU is still very much that the EU still needs and must rescue and provide the benefits for, provide the funds for the Greeks so they don't default. The primary reason for that is what happens with the rest of the EMU if Greece does. And that is very obvious. The private markets are being asked to lend to Greece are private. There are other places to put their money. And no one can force them to do it. This is why they're in the situation they're in. Now, let me look at some of these questions. So that's why I think the Greeks are very reluctant to sign on to the type of agreement and the type of austerity that the IMF will demand. I don't believe there is any stricture in any of the European treaties, I'm not 100% sure of this, that prohibits any member of the EMU or the EU from taking money from the IMF. It will, I think, give another large leg down to the euro. I agree with that. I don't think it will necessarily kill the euro. I don't really see the euro disappearing. But there is an increasing chance that the euro will become something other than it is right now. Whether that, I don't think anyone has ever, there's nothing in any of the EU treaties, creating the euro otherwise, that envision, it seems, this type of development. There are things that are prohibited, but there's nothing in there about a different structure for the euro. Now, there is, of course, the political argument, if you will, the political ego argument, if you will, that it means that the Europeans can't handle their own. I suppose that's true. I think it's a pretty weak argument, and I don't think it matters that much, to tell you the truth. I think to the German government and the German people, it's much more important that the euro be maintained as a strong currency and that they are not asked to pay for the Greek profligacy, which is essentially the case. Now, remember, referencing the 1992 when the speculators attacked Britain. Yes, there's an interesting fact there, but the analogy or the correlation is not perfect, because what they were trying to do then is to maintain the ERM. They were actually trying to maintain a rate mechanism within Europe amongst all of the currencies, where they would only be allowed to trade within a certain band, and it was up to the central bank to maintain that band by essentially intervening. That, of course, proved to be impossible, as Mr. Soros, in the most famous currency bet in history, correctly ascertained, and where he made his original billions, although he may have had billions before that, I don't know. In this case, we have not seen the Europeans really not only not intervening in the markets, but they're not even talking really about the trading value of the euro. I think, as I said earlier, they are in fact not totally displeased by the falling euro. It certainly gives some of their exports a greater chance in world competition, and that is something that I think they all are probably hoping for, and certainly the Germans right now. Yes, there is that definite possibility, and I think it does drive people crazy about the EU bureaucrats. You could say the same thing about we'll take it as an example, when the ECB under Mr. Trichet raised rates at quarter point in early July 2008. Did they not know what was going on? Is that possible? I've never been able to figure it out, to tell you the truth. They've been saying basically what me worry at that time. For 6 months, it's an American problem, subprime's an American problem. Our banks are sound, our banks are whole, we have no problem. As I've mentioned in past webinars, I had friends downtown at the time worked in asset securitization in many of the banks, and they were saying, what are these people talking about? We sold billions of this stuff, these assets, these securities, to the European banks. Their books are chock full of them. What is the EU talking about? What is the ECB talking about? So you have the same thing here. Did the EU bureaucrats not know that the Greeks were lying quite deliberately? when they spoke of how much their budget deficit was? Did they not know that the Greeks performed some of those various then legal and still legal currency swaps to get into the euro? And other governments did as well. My guess is you're correct. You bureaucrats did know, and the goal of unity was the overriding goal that the people who knew simply did not say, because it was politically unpalatable. And in fact, Greece might not have joined the euro had that been known. And the same thing is probably true for many bureaucrats. Don't forget, this has been, how can this webinar fit in with Forex trading? I think that's a direct criticism, but I know Mr. Boyd has been to many of our webinars before. Yes, what we're looking at here is the macro picture for the European Union and for the euro. If this entity, the euro and the ECB and the EU, do not get control of this situation, if they do not come in and somehow rescue or fund the Greek deficit as they roll over into the next several months, then the fundamental view of the euro, in my opinion, is another 10 figures down. So I suppose that's where it fits in. Until there is show me the money moment, my view of the euro is going to continue to be negative. If you look, it doesn't mean the euro is not going to go up and down. Of course it will. We all know trading like that. But when you look on balance, you have a serious macro drag on the euro. One of the things that the euro has benefited from is that it's never had to face a crisis like this. So the assumption was it would perform as it had. And I think that assumption is being very, very seriously questioned right now. Although honestly, being told I have to finish in 3 minutes, I will. Although honestly, I still have a hard time believing that this particular crisis will end with the Greek default and perhaps the Greeks withdrawing from the EMU. I do not think that will happen still. Two, the last point. So what I think is happening here is that, and I think this is to some degree quite deliberate, although it's not really what's stated. And as far as buying breakouts, I'd agree that, if it goes up, sell it a bit and see what happens. I've been short for some time in the euro and it's as well. I've also taken profit and then gone back in. I think what's happening here is that the EMU is being reformed under very tighter terms when it comes to national economies than were before. And that's why I have titled this talk, The German Reformation. Let me just see if there are any other questions here. Yes, you're correct. It was a common practice, that type of currency swap. The problem with the Greeks was they used it to actually lower their deficit numbers so they could get in and meet the criteria. So I suppose it's not whether or not it was done, but what it was done for and the time frame in which it was done. I, again, don't really see the Greeks leaving the EU, leaving the EMU, and adopting the drachma. However, I also thought that this particular crisis would have been solved some time ago. The fact that it's not means that there is some deliberate brinksmanship still being played within the EMU. And the problem with things like that are, since you're not sole actor in this, the outcome, as with wars, is often not what you envision. Well, I thank you very much. I hope this had some relevance. I apologize if it wasn't specifically Forex today, but I think that the macro picture here is one of great importance because the trend that we're looking at, take a look at that euro back to November, is absolutely a macro trend, and actually for short, macro profits. Anyway, thank you very much. I hope it was enjoyable. We'll see everybody next month. there are any holidays left, everybody enjoy them. Take care.